I still love him. I never stopped. I just didn't know how to hold on to someone who seemed ready to let go. I lost the baby alone. He was burying his father. I couldn't make him bury our child, too.
Grant Mercer had the divorce papers on the kitchen table, a pen in his hand, and 11 years of silence pressing down on his chest. He had made up his mind. Then came the night of Laurel's gathering and the sound of Elise crying behind a half-open door. He told himself to walk away. Instead, he stood frozen as her voice broke through. I still love him. I never stopped. I just didn't know how to hold on to someone who seemed ready to let go. Then came the words that stopped him completely. I lost the baby alone. He was burying his father. I couldn't make him bury our child, too. Grant stood motionless in that hallway. He had come here believing the marriage was already over. Now he wasn't sure he had ever understood it at all, or the woman he was about to walk away from. If you've ever felt like the people closest to you are strangers, you stop knowing how to reach. Stay with this one. And if stories like this mean something to you, subscribing to the channel takes 2 seconds and helps more than you'd think. Grant Mercer was the kind of man who could look at a broken piece of furniture and know exactly what it needed. He could run his fingers along a split grain of wood, feel where the weakness started, and understand which parts still had life in them. He had built Northline Woodworks from a rented corner of a storage facility in South Richmond into a proper workshop with 6 employees and a reputation solid enough to attract clients from 3 states over. His hands knew how to fix things. That had always been the part of himself he trusted most, which made it all the more unbearable that he couldn't figure out what had gone wrong with his marriage, or when exactly the silence between him and Elise had stopped feeling comfortable and started feeling like a verdict. They had been together for 13 years, married for 11. In the early days, Elise used to bring dinner to the workshop and sit on an overturned crate just to watch him sand down an old cabinet or rejoin a chair leg that had cracked under years of weight. She would leave small notes tucked inside his lunch bag. Not love letters exactly, just small observations, little drawings, things that said, "I was thinking about you today." She laughed easily back then, loudly, the kind of laugh that filled whatever room she was in. She worked at Commonwealth Literacy Center, helping children and adults who struggled with reading, and she carried that work home with her in the best way. She believed deeply that people deserved second chances, that something broken didn't mean something beyond saving. Somewhere in the last 2 years, all of that had gone quiet. Grant had noticed the shift but had not known how to name it. Elise stopped coming to the workshop. The notes disappeared. They began eating at different hours, exchanging information about bills and schedules rather than anything that actually mattered. They stopped sleeping in the same room without ever formally deciding to. He told himself it was the pressure, the financial strain that had been building since a major client pulled out of a contract without warning, leaving Northline exposed and bleeding. He had been working 16-hour days trying to hold things together, and he assumed Elise had simply grown tired of a husband who came home exhausted and distracted every night. He assumed she had pulled back because she was disappointed in him. That assumption had been living in him for so long that it had started to feel like fact. What he had not considered, what had never fully formed into a thought he allowed himself to have, was that Elise might be suffering in ways that had nothing to do with the workshop, and that her silence might not be distance, but something closer to survival. The evening before Laurel's gathering, Grant had sat alone in Northline after everyone else had gone home. On the workbench in front of him was a set of divorce papers he had picked up from his attorney earlier that week. He had not signed them yet. He had been holding them the way a person holds a decision they know is probably wrong, but can't see past. Elise had been texting frequently with a man named Vaughn Keller, someone she had known from graduate school, now a director at a high-end interior design firm in Philadelphia. Grant had seen a job offer on her laptop screen one evening when she left the room. He had seen photographs of a Philadelphia apartment saved in a folder on her desktop. He had not asked her about any of it. Instead, he had drawn a straight line between what he saw and what he feared, and he had decided the conclusion was obvious. She was preparing to leave. She had already made her choice. The papers were just him getting there first. He drove home and left them on the kitchen table. He didn't sign them that night. He told himself he would do it in the morning. The next evening, Elise mentioned that Laurel was having a small get-together. Just a few friends' dinner, nothing formal. She said she wanted Grant to come. She said it had been a long time since they had been somewhere together as a couple, and something in her voice when she said it made him feel the weight of that truth. He agreed to go, telling himself it was one last evening before everything changed. Laurel Dean lived in a renovated row house near the old Canal District, the kind of place that felt carefully lived in. Bookshelves covering every wall, mismatched chairs that somehow worked together, the smell of something slow-cooked coming from the kitchen. She was Elise's oldest friend, a children's book editor who had an opinion about everything and the confidence to share it without apology. Mara Keene was already there when they arrived, a former colleague of Elise's who had always been quieter than Laurel but no less observant. Grant shook hands and made conversation and watched Elise from across the room. She was laughing at something Laurel had said, and for a moment she looked the way she used to look, present, lit from within, comfortable in her own skin. Then her eyes moved to find his across the room, and whatever had been there a second before went carefully neutral. After dinner, Grant stepped outside to take a call from his workshop manager. There was a problem with a delivery, nothing that required him to drive in, but the conversation took longer than expected. By the time he came back inside, Elise had disappeared from the main room. He walked down the hallway toward the back of the house, and that was when he heard it. The low, unsteady sound of someone crying behind a door that had not been fully pulled shut. He should have kept walking, he knew that. But then he heard his name spoken in Elise's voice, and his feet stopped moving on their own. Inside the room, Elise was sitting with Laurel and Mara. Grant could not see them through the narrow gap in the door, but he could hear everything. Elise was trying to compose herself, her breath coming unevenly as she spoke. She said she didn't know how much longer she could keep doing this, going through the motions of a life that felt like it was happening around her rather than with her. She said Grant was the only person she had ever been with who made her feel like she had a real home, not a place to sleep, but an actual foundation. She said she remembered the years when they had almost nothing, when they would eat canned soup on the floor of the workshop and talk for hours about the house they would buy someday, the trips they would take, the family they imagined. She said she had held on to those memories for a long time longer than was probably reasonable. Mara asked gently what had changed. Elise said she didn't think anything had changed for Grant. She said that was the problem. She said she had watched him pull further and further inward, and that every time she considered reaching toward him, she saw how exhausted he already was and couldn't bring herself to add her own weight to what he was carrying. She said she had convinced herself that staying quiet was the same as being strong, and that somewhere along the way she had stopped being able to tell the difference. Then Laurel asked about Philadelphia. The room shifted. Elise took a slow breath before she answered. She said Vaughn Keller had offered her a position at his firm more than double her current salary, plus a signing bonus. She said she had been seriously considering it, not because she wanted to build a life with Vaughn, who she described with a flatness that left no room for misreading, but because the money would have been enough to clear a debt Grant didn't know she knew about, a debt that was threatening to close Northline within the year. Laurel's voice sharpened. She asked what Elise meant by a debt Grant didn't know she knew about. Elise said that 14 months ago, when Northline ran out of money to make payroll, she had sold the small lake house her mother had left her. She had transferred the entire amount to Grant's accountant, listed as a private investment from an outside source. Grant had believed the money came from an old client paying an overdue invoice. He had never known it was her. He had never known she had given up the only piece of her family she still had in order to keep his business alive. Standing in the hallway, Grant felt the air leave his body, but Elise wasn't finished. After a long, raw silence, she said there was something else. She said that the same week Grant's father died, she had found out she was pregnant. She had planned to tell him after the funeral, once the worst of the grief had passed. But 2 days after they buried his father, while Grant was at the workshop and she was alone in their house on Marlowe Avenue, she lost the baby. She had never told him. She said she couldn't. She said he had just buried his father and was fighting every day to keep Northline from collapsing. And she had looked at him and thought, I cannot hand him one more thing to grieve. I lost the baby alone. she said, her voice barely holding. "He was burying his father. I couldn't make him bury our child, too." Grant stood with one hand braced against the hallway wall. Everything he thought he had understood about the last 14 months, the distance, the silence, the way Elise had seemed to go somewhere he couldn't reach, was rearranging itself in real time. He had read her withdrawal as indifference. He had read her exhaustion as regret. He had spent months constructing a story in which she was preparing to leave him, and not once had he stopped to ask her what was actually happening. He made it outside before the full weight of it landed on him. He sat in his truck in the dark for a long time, then drove to Northline. He let himself into the empty workshop and sat at his bench, surrounded by pieces of furniture waiting to be restored. A dining table with a cracked center joint, a rocking chair with a hairline fracture running through one arm, a chest of drawers someone had tried to fix badly before bringing it to him. He had spent his whole career believing that almost anything could be saved if you were willing to understand it first, to take it apart carefully, and look at what was actually broken before reaching for the glue. He had not done that with Elise. He had taken the surface evidence and built a conclusion, and never once asked her to sit down and talk to him. When he heard her key in the front door at home that night, he was already there, sitting in the living room with the lights on. The divorce papers were still on the kitchen table where he had left them unsigned. Elise stopped in the doorway when she saw him, and the color shifted in her face. Grant looked at her steadily and said, "I heard the conversation." Elise did not speak. She stood very still. "Not on purpose," he said, "but I heard it." He looked at the papers on the table, then back at her. "Why did you carry all of that alone?" Elise crossed the room slowly and sat down across from him. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet and very tired. She said she hadn't known how to start. She said every time she thought about saying something, another week would pass, and the silence would calcify a little more until the truth felt like something too heavy to lift without dropping it on both of them. Grant told her about the divorce papers. He told her what he had seen on her laptop, the job offer, the apartment photographs, the months of watching her pull away and deciding he already knew why. He said he had been so certain he was about to be left that he had never stopped to consider he might be the one doing the leaving. Elise looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "I wasn't going to Philadelphia for Vaughn. I was going to pay back what you don't even know I gave you." Grant did not pick up the pen. He pushed the papers to the side and told her the only honest thing he had said in months. "I'm not ready to sign these, but I'm not ready to pretend tonight didn't happen either. I think we need real help, not just another night of not saying anything." Elise nodded. It was a small movement, barely visible, but it was the first thing either of them had agreed on in a very long time. Dr. Celia Rowan's office was on the 3rd floor of a converted building near the edge of downtown Richmond, the kind of space designed to feel neutral. 2 chairs angled toward each other, a window that looked out onto a row of old elms. Nothing on the walls that could be interpreted as taking sides. Grant had expected the first session to feel like a release. He had expected that once everything was out in the open, the pressure would ease the way it does when you finally locate a crack you've been unable to find by touch alone. Instead, sitting across from Elise in that quiet room, he felt the distance between them more precisely than he ever had in their own home. Dr. Rowan was measured and unhurried. She did not push them toward conclusions. She asked questions and waited, and what came out of that waiting was not relief, but friction, the kind that forms when 2 people who have been protecting the same wound from opposite sides finally have to look at it together. Grant told Dr. Rowan that what hurt him most was not the miscarriage itself, as devastating as that was to sit with, but the fact that Elise had been alone in their house on the worst day of her life and he had not known. He said he had been at the workshop 2 miles away while his wife was falling apart, and she had made the decision not to call him. Elise listened without interrupting. When it was her turn to speak, she said she understood why it felt that way to him, but that his description left out something important. She said that in the weeks after his father died, Grant had essentially disappeared into the workshop, answering messages when he felt like it, coming home after midnight, moving through the house like a man who had forgotten what rooms were for. She said she had stood outside the workshop door more than once with the intention of telling him everything, and each time she had looked through the window and seen him bent over a workbench with that particular kind of exhaustion that has no bottom to it, and she had turned around and gone home. It had not felt like a choice so much as an impossibility. Dr. Rowan let the quiet settle before observing carefully that both of them seemed to be operating under the same assumption that they each knew better than the other what the other person could bear. She said that kind of certainty, however well-intentioned, was one of the most effective ways two people could end up utterly alone inside the same marriage. That observation opened something Grant hadn't expected to face in the first session. Dr. Rowan asked him directly whether there was anything he had been withholding from Elise in the same way she had withheld things from him. Grant sat with the question longer than was comfortable, then told the truth. Northline Woodworks was not simply struggling. It was carrying a debt of close to $96,000 accumulated over 18 months of reduced income and overextended contracts. He had taken on jobs at rates below what the work was worth just to keep money moving through the business. He had not told Elise because he was ashamed, because he had watched her sacrifice everything to keep the workshop alive and could not bring himself to admit that the crisis she had tried to fix was not actually fixed. Elise went still in her chair. Then she said quietly, but with an edge underneath it, that she had given up the last thing her mother had left her, a small house on a lake she had spent summers in as a child, and that money had bought them 14 months. That was all. Because Grant had never once sat down with her and said, "Here is what's actually happening. Here is what we actually need." Grant said that was fair. He said it was also true that she had made a decision involving a significant amount of money without saying a word to him. Elise said that was different. Grant said he wasn't sure it was. The session ended before either of them could find a way back from the edge of that exchange, and they drove home in separate cars. The 72-hour ultimatum from Vaughn Keller arrived by phone on a Tuesday afternoon. Vaughn said the firm had another candidate in consideration and couldn't hold the position open any longer. He was pleasant about it in the way that people are pleasant when they know they have leverage. He mentioned almost in passing that watching someone you cared about wait indefinitely for a situation to improve was its own kind of heartbreak. Elise said she would think about it. Vaughn said she deserved better than having to think about it. She brought the contract to the next session and set it on the low table between the chairs without comment. Dr. Rowan asked Grant what he felt when he looked at it. Grant said he felt like he was looking at proof of every failure he hadn't been able to keep private. Then Dr. Rowan asked him what he actually wanted, not what he thought was fair, not what he thought Elise deserved, but what he himself wanted. Grant looked at the contract for a long moment. Then he said he didn't want her to go. He said he was aware of how that sounded given the state of things, and he was aware that wanting her to stay and having earned the right to ask her to stay were two different things, but that she had asked for honesty, and that was the honest answer. Elise looked at him when he said it. Something in her face shifted not toward resolution, but toward something more complicated and more real than anything they had managed in recent months. She said she had needed to hear him say that out loud, not to be convinced, but because she had spent a long time wondering if he would actually say it if given the chance, or if he would find a way to turn her leaving into a sacrifice he was generously allowing her to make. She took out her phone and called Vaughn from the chair in Dr. Rowan's office. She told him she was declining the position. She also told him that his habit of framing her marriage as a problem he could solve by offering her an exit was something she had tolerated too long, and that she would appreciate it if future communication remained strictly professional. Vaughn's response was brief. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. After she hung up, Grant told her he had decided to downsize Northline. He said he would sell off the larger equipment, move the operation into a smaller space, and stop chasing contracts that required a scale the business could no longer honestly support. It was the first decision either of them had made in a long time that didn't happen behind the other's back, and it sat differently in the room because of that. The complications that followed were slow and grinding, the kind that wear at a person's resolve not through a single blow, but through accumulated pressure. Northline had been shortlisted for a restoration contract at Copperlight Hall, a historic event venue undergoing major renovation. the kind of project that could have stabilized the business for the better part of a year. Within 4 days of Elise declining Vaughn's offer, the firm quietly notified Grant that Northline had been removed from consideration. No explanation was given. Grant did not need one. Elise figured out the connection on her own and spent 3 days moving around the house carrying a guilt she couldn't put down. Grant told her it hadn't been her call to make, but the financial pressure was real regardless of its source. Northline received a formal notice that the lease on its current space would not be renewed unless the outstanding balance was cleared within 30 days. The fundraising event at Copperlight Hall, which they attended at Laurel's insistence, was the kind of evening that tested how much a person could hold without visibly cracking. The hall was beautifully restored, every detail considered exactly the kind of work Grant's team would have done well, and walking through it knowing Northline had been cut from the project was its own particular form of endurance. Vaughn was there. He approached Elise when Grant was on the other side of the room, and by the time Grant crossed back to her, the conversation had already taken a turn. Vaughn was saying with a measured calm, more unsettling than anger, that the position in Philadelphia had been filled, but that he would be willing to revisit the conversation if her situation at home hadn't improved. Grant arrived in time to hear the last part of it. He felt something rise in him that had nothing to do with logic, and he stepped forward. Elise put her hand firmly on his arm, not pulling him back but making clear she wasn't finished. She turned to Vaughn and said in a voice entirely without heat that Northline might fail and Grant might lose the workshop, but that none of that gave Vaughn the right to position himself as the better alternative every time their finances got difficult. She said she understood what he had been doing, not offering her an opportunity, but building a case, month by month, that her husband was the obstacle between her and the life she deserved. She said she was done pretending she hadn't noticed. Vaughn left without responding. The drive home was quiet in a way that felt different from their usual quiet, less like avoidance and more like two people processing the same evening from the inside. But when they arrived, the letter from the landlord was on the kitchen counter where Grant had left it that morning, and the evening shifted again. Grant said the only realistic path forward was to sell the house on Marlowe Avenue. Elise said the house was the only thing they still had that felt like evidence of the life they were trying to rebuild. Grant said that was exactly the problem, that they couldn't afford to treat evidence of the past as though it were the same as a future. The argument that followed was the worst they'd had in months, not because of what was said at the loudest moments, but because of what came at the end, when both of them were exhausted and had run out of the careful language they had been practicing in Dr. Rowan's office. Elise said Grant was willing to sacrifice their marriage to protect his pride. Grant said she had spent years making decisions for both of them, and then resenting him for not understanding choices she had never let him make. Then Grant said something he could not pull back. Quietly, without looking at her directly, "Maybe you should have taken the job. Maybe your life would actually be better without me in it." Elise stood in the kitchen and looked at him for a long time, with an expression that had gone very still. Then she walked to the bedroom, and Grant heard the sound of a drawer opening. The next morning, Elise packed a bag and said she was staying with Laurel for a while. She said she wasn't leaving the marriage or Richmond, but that she needed to be somewhere she could think without the weight of everything accumulated in those walls pressing down on her. Grant did not ask her to stay. He told himself it was because he was respecting her decision, but watching her car pull away, he understood that what he had actually done was prove her right. He went back to Northline. He sold the 3 largest machines in the workshop and used the money to cut final checks for every one of his employees. When the last person left and the shop fell silent, Grant sat at his workbench and pulled the divorce papers from the kitchen drawer. He had carried them back to the workshop earlier that week without quite knowing why. He looked at them for a long time. Then he signed his name, drove to the house on Marlowe Avenue, and left them on the dining room table. No note, no explanation, just his signature on the line and the quiet of a house that no longer felt like anyone's home. That evening, Elise returned to collect some documents. She saw the signed papers on the table. She stood there for a long time, then picked them up, folded them, and placed them in her bag. She did not call him. Instead, she contacted the interior design firm in Philadelphia directly, not Vaughn, but the company's HR office to ask whether the position had been permanently filled or if there was still any flexibility. By the next morning, she had a response and a new set of documents waiting in her email. Grant spent 2 nights on the cot in the back of Northline before he allowed himself to return to the house on Marlowe Avenue. He told himself he was going to collect a change of clothes and check the mail. What he actually did was stand in the kitchen for a long time looking at the dining room table where the divorce papers had been and were no longer. Elise had been back. He hadn't known she was coming and she hadn't told him. The absence of the papers felt louder than their presence had. He went to the bedroom to get his things and noticed the top drawer on Elise's side of the dresser was partially open. She had taken what she needed quickly, he could tell by the particular carelessness of someone trying not to spend too much time in a room that hurt. He opened his own drawer and found, sitting on top of his folded shirts, a small wooden box he recognized immediately. He had made it years ago, walnut with dovetail corners, built on a slow afternoon when he was first learning the joint. He had given it to Elise without ceremony, and she had kept it on her nightstand for years before it quietly disappeared from his notice. He had assumed she had moved it to a closet somewhere. He had not thought to ask. He lifted the lid. Inside, arranged with a care that was painful to look at directly, were things he had not known existed, and things he had not known she had kept. There was an ultrasound image, small and slightly faded, the date printed along the bottom edge. There was a hospital bracelet with Elise's name on it, dated 2 days after his father's funeral. There was a folded receipt, the sale document for the lake house, the numbers printed plainly, her signature at the bottom. And beneath all of it, a small stack of letters written on the cream-colored notepad she kept on her desk, each one folded in thirds and unsealed. Grant sat on the edge of the bed and read every one of them. They were not angry letters. That was the first thing that struck him. He had braced for accusation and found instead something much harder to absorb. The letters were written at different points over the past 14 months, addressed to him in the second person, as though she had been practicing a conversation she couldn't figure out how to start. In one, she described the morning she lost the baby, the specific, ordinary details of it, the light through the kitchen window, the sound the house made, the fact that she had called Laurel because she couldn't think of what else to do and couldn't bring herself to call him. She wrote that she had sat on the bathroom floor for a long time afterward and thought about his voice, and had wanted more than anything to hear it, and had not picked up the phone because she kept imagining the weight of his grief and could not figure out how to add to it without breaking something already fractured. In another letter written months later, she described driving to Northline on a Saturday afternoon with the intention of going inside and saying everything she hadn't said. She had sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes before driving away. She wrote, "I don't need you to fix this. I don't need you to know what to say. I just need you to be in the room with me so I'm not the only one who knows it happened." The last letter was the shortest, written the week after their final argument at the house. She had written only a few lines. She wrote that she could live in any city and make a life that looked acceptable from the outside. She wrote that the only thing she didn't know how to do was call somewhere home if he wasn't in it. And she wrote that she was no longer sure he wanted to be. Grant set the letters down and looked at the ultrasound image for a long time. The room was very quiet. He sat with all of it, the box, the letters, the bracelet, the receipt, and understood that signing those papers had not been a merciful ending. It had been the same mistake he had been making for over a year, wearing a different face. He had decided again what Elise needed without asking her. He had decided that releasing her was a kindness, when what it actually was. Stripped of the story he had told himself was a way to avoid admitting how frightened he was that she might choose to leave on her own. He called Laurel. She picked up on the second ring, and before she could say anything, he asked if Elise was still there. Laurel said she was leaving within the hour. She had a train to Philadelphia. Grant asked how long he had. Laurel gave him the departure time and said nothing else. He understood that was its own form of opinion. He drove to the station. The Richmond Staples Mill station had the particular quality of all transit spaces: temporary, indifferent, full of people in the middle of transitions they had already decided on. Grant found Elise near the far end of the platform. She had one suitcase and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from having made a decision and committed to holding it. She looked up when she heard his steps, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Grant crossed the platform and stopped in front of her. He was carrying the wooden box. He held it out and she took it, her eyes moving from the box to his face, trying to understand what it meant that he had found it. He told her he had read the letters. He said he was not there to argue or to ask her to undo a decision she had every right to make. Then he asked her quietly if she still had the divorce papers. Elise looked at him for a moment, then reached into her bag and took them out. Grant took the papers from her hand, found the page with his signature, and tore it cleanly away from the document. Not dramatically. He just separated it and held it, and then told her what he had come to say. He said he had spent their entire marriage believing that keeping things from her was a form of protection, that absorbing difficulty alone was the same as being strong, and that she would think less of him if she saw the parts that weren't holding together. He said he had been so committed to that version of strength that he had completely missed the fact that she was doing the exact same thing from the other direction. He said he had signed those papers because he had told himself it was for her benefit, and that he was done pretending that was true. He had signed them because he was scared, because it was easier to end things on his own terms than to sit in the uncertainty of not knowing whether she would choose to stay. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need rescuing," he said. "I'm asking because I don't want to be the person I've been for the last 2 years anymore. But I need you to tell me what you actually want, not what you think I can handle. What you want." Elise looked at him for a long time. A train announcement moved through the platform and faded. She held the wooden box against her side with both hands. When she spoke, her voice was even, but not without effort. She said she owed him the same honesty. She said she had spent so long managing what she let him see that she had lost track of the difference between protecting him and protecting herself from the risk of being fully known and still not being enough. She said the baby was the thing she hadn't been able to come back from alone, and that every month she didn't tell him, it became more a part of the structure of who she was in the marriage rather than something that had happened to them. "I needed you to know," she said. "Not so you could fix it. I just needed to not be the only one carrying it." Grant said he understood that now. He said he should have been easier to reach, and that he was going to work on that not as a negotiation, but as something he owed both of them regardless of what she decided. The train arrived. The doors opened. People moved around them with the efficiency of travelers who know exactly where they're going. Elise looked at the open doors, then back at Grant and stood on the platform without moving toward them. She said she wasn't getting on the train, but she also wasn't ready to go back to the house on Marlowe Avenue and act as though 2 years could be resolved by one honest conversation on a platform. She said she wanted to go to Dr. Rowan's office today now and say all of this in a room built to hold it, with someone who could help them figure out what came next before either of them defaulted to old habits. Grant called Dr. Rowan from the platform. She had a cancellation that afternoon, he told Elise. She picked up her suitcase and they walked to his truck together. What followed was not a recovery so much as a reconstruction, slower, less symmetrical, and more honest than anything they had built before. They sold the house on Marlowe Avenue 4 months later, but it was a decision made together over several conversations, not a concession extracted in a moment of desperation. The money cleared what remained of Northline's debt and left enough to establish a shared account they both had visibility into, with a simple agreement that any major financial decision required a conversation first. It was a small rule, almost embarrassingly practical. It held. Grant moved Northline into a smaller space on the east side of Richmond, a converted garage with room for essential equipment and not much else. He let go of the contracts that had required the business to operate beyond what it could sustain and began running weekend workshops for teenagers referred through Commonwealth Literacy Center. Kids who had struggled in traditional classroom settings and responded to the particular patience that working with wood requires. It had been Elise's suggestion, and it was the first professional idea they had built together in years. They named the program Second Grain. The ultrasound image and the hospital bracelet no longer lived in a drawer. Grant built a small frame from a piece of walnut he had been saving without a clear purpose, and they placed it in their shared office in the smaller house they rented near a park on the north side of the city. Elise had asked if he was sure. He said yes, and she believed him, which itself was evidence of something real. Vaughn Keller sent one more message 3 weeks after the day at the train station. Elise replied with 2 sentences professionally worded and final in tone, then forwarded the history of his communications to the appropriate people at his firm. She told Grant immediately afterward. He said she had handled it exactly right. It was a small moment. It mattered anyway. On the afternoon of the second grain session, one of the students, a 15-year-old who hadn't said much since arriving, stood in front of a workbench, looking at a dining chair with a cracked back leg, and asked Grant whether it was worth fixing. Grant crouched down, ran his thumb along the break, felt where the wood on either side was still sound. "You can't make it like it never broke," he said. "But if you understand where the crack is, you can make it stronger than it was before." Elise was standing near the door. She heard it. On the drive home that evening, she reached across and put her hand over his on the gear shift. He turned his hand over so their palms were together, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. Only the quiet of 2 people who had finally stopped mistaking silence for safety and had learned at real cost that the only kind of silence worth keeping is the kind with nothing hidden underneath it. A lot of marriages don't end because 2 people stop loving each other. They end because both people are hurting, both people think they're protecting the other, and nobody says the thing that actually needs to be said. Grant and Elise almost let that happen. Maybe you know someone in that same kind of silence right now. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And subscribe if you want more stories about the quiet, complicated ways people find their way back to each other. There's a lot more to come.